In the previous module, we considered the political legacy of colonialism faced by the post-colonial state as it attempted to develop. Today, we'll look at colonialism's economic legacy. You'll recall from previous lectures that the economies of the colonies were fundamentally structured in several important ways. First, domestic industries were often undermined or destroyed to make the colony dependent on export of manufactured goods from the colonizer. In order to compete with Indian textile manufacturers, the British government imposed steep tariffs on Indian exports, eventually banning altogether the import of calico or cotton cloth from India. When it failed, the British soldiers in India were ordered to smash Indian looms and to cut off the thumbs of Indian weavers to prevent them from producing cloth that might compete with lower quality British textiles. It's hardly surprising then that Gandhi's strategy of nonviolent resistance to British colonial rule centered in part on spinning his own cloth and producing his own clothing. The second way the economies of the colonies were fundamentally restructured centered on the control of land. Remember the British colonial policy of res nullius, the idea that land which was not being used for profitable economic activity was by definition unoccupied. Colonial policy generally resulted in a confiscation of land and its gifting to colonial settlers and businesses. Male settlers moving to Australia, for example, could claim 30 acres of land, receiving an additional 20 acres if they were married, and an additional 10 acres per child. Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Britain all offered land grants to settlers willing to relocate to the New World. Land grants were also common in Asia and Africa. These grants generally resulted in the dislocation of indigenous communities who had historically resided on or farmed the land. Some were transformed into tenant farmers who were now required to pay rent to the new land's owner. Most were just expelled from the land and forced to move to less productive, more environmentally unstable regions. And in any case, they were generally not granted rights of ownership or title, meaning that their status was always precarious. Not surprisingly, the land question would become one of the most important questions faced by all post-colonial governments in their efforts to achieve economic development and to overcome the colonial legacy. A third way in which the economies of the colonies were restructured centers on the promotion of particular kinds of economic activity. Traditional economies, with their broad diversity of activities all geared towards the maintenance of the local community, were restructured to focus on the production of basic commodities for global markets. Colonies, particularly in the era of industrial colonialism, were supposed to provide the raw materials necessary to support industrialization of the colonizing country. Let's consider each of these in a bit more detail. It's difficult to understate the impact of colonialism on the development of local economies in the global South. This graph traces the proportion of the global gross domestic product, dividing it into the area produced by the developed economies in the global North in blue, and the area produced by the developing economies in the global South in yellow. In the year 1500, economies comprising today's developing economies were responsible for nearly 80% of all global economic activity. But as colonialism progressed, that proportion declined. Developed countries, primarily the colonial powers, claimed a larger and larger share of the world's economic activity. We can also think of this in terms of economic activities of individual countries. In the year 1700, China and India together were responsible for about half of all global economic activity. Europe, by contrast, was responsible for a little less than 1/4. By the early 1950s, however, the Chinese and Indian share of the global economic activity had declined to less than 10%, while Europe's activity, despite the impact of World War II, had risen to almost 1/3. These trends were the combined result of industrialization in the global North, which depended in part on the primary commodities produced in the global South, as well as on the conscious efforts to undermine economic activity in the global South itself. Land reform also became a central issue for the post-colonial state, as we discussed in the previous module. In many colonies, people were forced from their lands, either made tenant farmers or laborers on their own land or forced to more marginal areas. Colonial land policy had a couple of important implications. First, it often undermined traditional agricultural practices and led to environmental degradation. Many pre-colonial societies were semi-nomadic. Communities would move up from a particular area, settle it for a few years, grow food there, and then move on to a new area, allowing the previously farmed areas to regenerate soil health by remaining fallow, sometimes for decades. The introduction of colonial land tenure systems forced communities into smaller and smaller areas, reducing the total amount of land available, reducing mobility, and thus shortening fallow periods. In some cases, traditional migratory communities were forced into permanent settlement. This led to a rapid degradation of soil health, facilitating poor agricultural yields and leading to broad environmental destruction. Second, by displacing communities and redistributing land holdings, colonial policy generated unequal patterns of land ownership that generated local tensions, particularly in the settler colonies, as we discussed in the previous module. As we'll learn later, though, addressing land questions often became the central precondition for securing economic development. Countries like South Korea that were able to redistribute land were often in much better positions to secure economic growth. But in most post-colonial states, land is a central source of economic and thus political power. Those who own the land are unwilling to give it up for redistribution. Consequently, land reform has almost always been accompanied by violence or repressive state intervention. We'll return to this point later in the course. The final point we noted in the introduction was that colonial economies were generally reconstructed around the export of a single primary commodity. This primary commodity dependence carried over into the post-colonial economy. Indeed, even today, many developing countries remain highly dependent on a single primary commodity for the bulk of their export earnings. This map illustrates the scope of primary commodity dependence in the developing world. Countries in dark green, for example, earn 80% of their export earnings from oil. Similarly, countries in orange are dependent on agricultural commodities like cotton, cocoa, tobacco, bananas, or fishing for the majority of their export earnings. The theory of comparative advantage holds that countries should specialize in producing what they're relatively good at producing and import other items. If everyone does this, all countries will be better off. We'll explore this idea in more detail next week. But for now, we should note that the relative price of primary commodities has tended to be less stable and suffer from greater periods of decline than manufactured goods over time. This trend is known as the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. The Prebisch-Singer hypothesis captured a general trend in the price of commodities, particularly during the post-World War II development era. As the graph here illustrates, the relative prices for primary and tropical and non-tropical agricultural commodities, as well as for minerals, has generally declined over the long term, despite sharply fluctuating prices over the short term. Even setting aside the sharp price spikes associated with 1979 and 1973 oil crises, the real prices, adjusted for inflation, of primary commodities declined by 40% from 1970 to 1998. The declining values of primary commodity exports led to a generalized decline in terms of trade for developing countries. Terms of trade refer to the quantity of exports required to pay for a specific quantity of imports for a given country. Declining terms of trade thus means that countries have had to export more to pay for the same quantity of imports. Between 1980 and 2000, regional terms of trade declined for Asia, the Pacific excluding Japan, Africa, East Asia, and South America. Terms of trade improved for Southeastern Asia, the Middle East, primarily driven by increasing oil prices after the 1980s, Western Europe, and Japan. It's important to note that in recent years, increasing commodity prices have reversed some of the declines that occurred in the 20th century. Since 2002, increasing commodity prices, particularly for oil and minerals, have led to improvements in the terms of trade for some developing countries, leading some observers to conclude that the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis may not always hold true. What we do know, though, is that commodity prices are determined in part by the elasticity of demand. Demand elasticity refers to the degree to which demand for a commodity changes relative to the price of that commodity. When demand is relatively elastic, reductions in the price of a commodity can often lead to increases in demand that offset declines in price per unit. In this example of elastic demand, reducing the price of a commodity by 25 cents per unit leads to an increase in demand for that commodity of 6 units. While we may earn less per unit sold, the total income increases from $3, that is 3 units sold at $1 each, to $6.75, that is 9 units sold at 75 cents each. But when demand is relatively inelastic, the increased demand may not offset the loss per unit sold. Here we see that reducing the price of a commodity from $2 per unit to $1 per unit only generates additional demand for 2 units. As a result, total income decreases from $4.50 to $2.50. The question, of course, is the degree to which demand for particular commodities is elastic or inelastic. There is good reason to believe that demand for many primary commodities is relatively inelastic. I'm unlikely to consume significantly more bananas if the price of bananas declines sharply. This will be important when we discuss structural adjustment in the next module. There are other reasons why primary commodities might tend to decline over time. In addition to the elasticity of demand, the price of primary commodities relative to the price of manufactured goods has also tended to decline because of the substitutability of primary commodities. Greater efficiency in manufacturing processes has tended to reduce both the quantity of primary commodities used and to create substitutes for some commodities. Cars produced today, for example, use considerably less steel than they did 20 years ago, both because we use materials more efficiently and because we have substituted other commodities like plastics for steel. We also know that primary commodity dependence is negatively correlated with economic growth, as this graph demonstrates. That is, economies which are highly dependent on primary commodity or resource exports tend to grow more slowly than economies that are less dependent on resource exports. This seems to run counter to the example provided by countries like Qatar, or to a common sense understanding of development that suggests that oil-rich countries might be better positioned to develop. But remember that while a handful of countries, like Qatar, Kuwait, or the United Arab Emirates, have been able to translate resource endowments into broader economic development, many, like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, have suffered as a result of resource-fueled civil wars, leading to a widespread discussion of a resource curse and suggesting that resource wealth may undermine development.